All right, everyone. So today we are going to begin Unit 1, which is going to explore the profound cultural, artistic, and intellectual revival that began in the 14th century, a time period commonly referred to as the Renaissance. We're going to look at groundbreaking works of art and literature to advancements in science and philosophy, and the Renaissance as a period of extraordinary transformation. So through our notes today, I'm going to guide you through the key figures, concepts, and events from this remarkable era. So let's get started. So let's start with defining this time period. Now, modern historians tend to define this as a period between the 15th and 17th century, so 14 to 1600s, of European cultural, artistic, and economic rebirth on the Italian peninsula following the Middle Ages. Now, eventually it will spread beyond the Italian peninsula into Northern Europe, into places like Flanders, which is in modern-day Belgium, or in Germany. We're going to simply focus on the Italian Renaissance today and stay within those borders. And Renaissance, it equals rebirth. And again, this is a rebirth of classical learning, literature, and art. So let's start with looking at why did it begin in Italy? Of all places, why Italy? And there are three main causes that Italy is kind of the focal point of the Renaissance. First, a revival of trade, commerce, and towns. So at the end of the Middle Ages, there was an event known as the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which killed upwards of 50% of the world population. And that would, in the short term, hit trade and commerce and obviously the population of towns very hard. But in the long term, we're going to see a revival of these things, and we're going to see Italy become kind of a gateway between Eastern kingdoms and countries and Western kingdoms and countries. So it's going to become very metropolitan with a lot of different people from all over the known world at that time crossing through and into Italy. It's also going to lead to the development of a very wealthy merchant class. And this is going to be important because the art and literature and other works produced during the Renaissance are going to require patrons or people of means that can fund the art of people like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and other individuals we're going to talk about later in this presentation. A second reason is the presence of antiquity, of Greece and Rome being stronger in Italy. If you've ever traveled to Italy and you look around, you see ruins and architecture from the time period of the Roman Empire, which borrowed heavily from Greek culture. So they had this kind of foundation of antiquity all around them in Italy. And then lastly, you had a strong banking system. One prominent figure within this banking system was the de' Medici family in Florence, Italy, which was a center of art and literature of the Renaissance. And the de' Medici family were one of the largest patrons of the arts during this time period. And they were a very powerful and influential family that many artists depended on. So here's the world that we are discussing. Now, we'll focus mainly on Italy, which looks very different from the Italy that maybe we imagine in our own mind of modern day, because this is not a unified Italy. During the time of the Renaissance, when it was beginning, this is happening in an Italy that is not unified. It is made up of many different republics and kingdoms and countries. You can see, the Papal States, which is the state and territory controlled by the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church. You see Tuscany, Genoa, Venice. There's Naples, Sicily, and many others. So this is not a unified Italy. And Europe as a whole, as you can see, looks very, very different. So this is the time period that we're looking at here in the 1450s. Now, most people tend to think of the Renaissance in terms of its great artwork and sculptures. But it was also a time of great literature and ideas. And one influential writer was this individual, Niccolo Machiavelli, who wrote The Prince, which informed the actions of many rulers. And you can still see this work mentioned today in modern political circles. If you watch political news, sometimes you'll hear of people being referred to as Machiavellian. So what exactly does that mean? Well, Machiavelli in his work, The Prince, advocated for a strong, merciless ruler. He is actually the individual who coined the phrase that you've probably heard of that said that it's better to be feared than loved. More precisely, the direct quote is, "It is much safer to be feared than loved, because love is preserved by the link of obligation, which, owing to the baseness of men, is broken at every opportunity for their advantage. But fear preserves you by a dread of punishment, which never fails." He also coined the phrase, "the ends justify the means." So he was an advocate of a ruler doing whatever they must do in order to reach their goal for the betterment of their state. So he was not concerned with concepts of good or evil or good and bad as individuals might be. And he actually believed that people must recognize that private morality cannot be applied to public affairs. So in other words, what this means is what we might see as right and wrong as individuals, we cannot apply those same standards of right and wrong to ruling over large groups of people. He believed that sometimes rulers must do things that individuals might see as morally wrong, but in the long run is going to be for the betterment of the state as a whole, even if it is something that is not, technically good. And he is known as the father of modern political science. And you can see for good reason. Now another idea developed during the time period of the Renaissance was humanism. And this is when individuals began to study Greek and Latin classics, such as, the work of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and other philosophers, in hopes of kind of reviving ancient values. So humanists, they believed in doing what is best for the state and society. They also kind of viewed life on earth from kind of a secular lens, and secular is generally viewed as non-religious. So humanists believe that as individuals we have to focus on life on earth and having a happy life on earth versus on just waiting until we die and get a reward with heaven in the afterlife. This is a very significant shift in thinking from the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, the church was the center of your world. People were not concerned about necessarily living happy lives on earth. Many people lived very hard, short lives during this time period, but the belief was you would do what you could for society while on earth, and then you would be rewarded in the afterlife. This was not the case during the Renaissance. Petrarch, who's this gentleman here on the right, he is considered to be the father of humanism. So he's one of the early kind of proponents of this line of thinking that other people would pick up and kind of carry forward. All right, so let's look at Renaissance art and its defining characteristics. There are 6 key characteristics that will use this painting, The Delivery of the Keys, painted by Pietro Perugino from 1481 to 1482, to help illustrate this. So the first characteristic is vivid, bright colors, which you can see in the image with the clothing of these individuals. Very bright, very vivid, and this is going to be a marked departure from medieval art, which has a very limited color palette, extremely muted colors, dark in many ways, not bright like we're seeing in this image. Idealized beauty. The individual is kind of seen as almost kind of his perfect self. Okay, people are painted without really many flaws within their person. Linear perspective. Okay, we can see that in the image with the way that our eyes are kind of drawn to the back. Okay, you usually have individuals kind of in the middle who serve as a center point, and then our eyes are drawn back, and this is going to add a depth and realism to this photo because we kind of feel like you can go back into this painting. Then next we have a technique in Renaissance art known as chiaroscuro, which this is a very fancy word to basically describe the contrast of light and dark to create kind of a 3D look. A perfect example of this is if you look back here in the building, look at kind of the shadow and the use of darker colors on this side of the building than the other side of the building to kind of demonstrate, this is the shaded part of the building, which gives it kind of a 3D look. And you see the same thing in like the arches in the buildings, which again kind of add to that look of depth and 3D imagery, which again, very different from medieval art, which tended to be more 2D in nature. Balance and symmetry and proportionality. So again, you can see that balance in the image. You've got, again, our two individuals here in the center, and then people on both sides, but it looks pretty equal. I mean, I'm not going to count the individuals, but you can look just by the eye, it looks pretty equal. Even in the background, you have the building in the center that we've pointed out already, but then look, you've got two buildings on each side, which kind of balance that out and give it a sense of proportionality. Classical themes. Okay, these tended to be Greek, Roman, and biblical figures that dominate, and that's no different in this image. The individual in the middle is Jesus Christ receiving the keys from this man on bended knee. So it's telling a biblical tale here in this painting. So let's look at some of the Renaissance artists from this time period, and we'll look at some examples of their key works of art and kind of how it fits these characteristics. And let's start with Raphael, who lived between 1483 and 1520. You can see an image of what we believe Raphael looked like here in the right hand upper corner. Now, Raphael, he was well known for his paintings of the Madonna. You can see two examples here from the early 1500s. On the left, you have the Madonna of the Pinks, which he painted circa 1506, 1507. And on the right, you have the Madonna of the Meadow, which he painted in 1506. Now, his most famous work of art, though, was not biblical in nature at all, but more took from Greek and Roman figures. And it's known as the School of Athens, which is within what was the private quarters of the Pope, because this work was commissioned by Pope Julius II, who was a large patron of the arts and one of Raphael's patrons. And his works tended to depict Christian themes, as we see with the Madonnas, but as well as Christian themes, he also depicted ancient Greek and Roman scientists and philosophers, which we can see in School of Athens here, which he painted between 1509 and 1511. And again, this resides in the Pope's private quarters, or what were his private quarters during this time. And it's actually part of a larger story being told by Raphael, because this is one wall, and then on the three other walls there's other paintings that are less well known in School of Athens. Now, if we look at this, we can identify the trends that we just talked about. Those characteristics of Renaissance art. So again, we can see, the vivid colors of the people's clothes, very bright color palette, throughout the painting. It is balanced and proportional. Again, we see two figures here in the center, and you can see that from either side there's about an equal number of people. Again, when we're looking at people, they're kind of evenly distributed, but even more than that, if you look in the background, you've got a statue here, you've got a statue here, so one on each side. We've got that linear perspective we talked about again, so it looks like it goes back further, so it gives that kind of illusion of depth here, and that's accomplished through that chiaroscuro technique that we talked about. So again, you can see that with the arches, where they use kind of darker colors to imitate kind of shadows and shading, which kind of give it that depth of realism. So you can see many of those things. And again, the theme here, these are classical characters from Greek and Roman times. Most notably, if you look in the center, those two individuals, that is Socrates on the left and his student Plato on the right, two of the most well-known philosophers in Greek history. And then there's many others throughout this painting, such as Pythagoras, of Pythagorean theorem fame, Hippocrates, who is the Hippocratic Oath that doctors still follow today, and many, many others. Another fun fact for this painting, at least I find it fun and interesting, is that if you look really closely right here, Raphael actually hides himself within his own painting. He's kind of tucked away here in the corner. Now our next artist is Leonardo da Vinci, who lived between 1452 and 1519. And he was a widely acclaimed painter. He was an advisor to the kings. He was an engineer, a physiologist, a botanist, an inventor, and much, much more. And we see some of his most famous works. If we work kind of left to right here at the bottom, obviously probably his most famous work was the Mona Lisa, which he painted in 1503. This hangs in the Louvre in Paris, France, and millions of people come to see this work of art every year. Next to it, you have a physiological sketch of the human brain and skull that Leonardo da Vinci completed in 1510. He was very interested in the human body and studying kind of how we as human beings worked. Next to it is a more religious themed painting known as Salvator Mundi, which was completed in 1500. And then one of his earlier works here on the right-hand side is the Vitruvian Man, which he drew out in 1485. And again, kind of looking at the symmetry of the human body. Now, another extremely famous work of art outside of the Mona Lisa that most people recognize Leonardo da Vinci for is this one, The Last Supper, which he painted between 1495 and 1498. And again, we can see the trends that we've been pointing out. Again, you've got bright clothing of all these individuals here. Okay, so we're using bright colors. Okay, you have that sense of depth. Like you see these kind of panels on the side of the wall here. These kind of draw the eye back to give it that kind of sense of depth. It's very proportional. You've got Jesus sitting in the center here, and then on each side you've got 6 of the disciples, so very proportional and symmetrical. And then again, that shading, that chiaroscuro is all throughout this. You can see it, all throughout the sides here, in the back, the ceiling, kind of using that light and dark to help give that 3D imagery or depth to the work of art. And obviously, this is a very well-known biblical painting depicting the Last Supper of Jesus Christ before crucifixion. So follows those trends of Renaissance art. Next is probably the least well-known of all the painters that we're looking at today, and that's Sandro Botticelli. He lived between 1445 and 1510, and secular paintings were kind of his theme. Sometimes they were even seen as pagan, and that was largely due to a lot of the content of his paintings being based in ancient mythology, so gods and goddesses. Now, not all of his paintings were based in mythology. Some were religious in nature, which you can see here. This is basically the birth of Christ, the manger scene. It's called the Adoration of the Magi, which he painted between 1475 and 76. Another fun fact, he's another painter that loves to hide himself in his artwork. Here he is, standing off to the right. Now, he was patroned by the de' Medici family in Florence, and his most famous work is probably The Birth of Venus, which again is going to borrow from that ancient mythology for inspiration. So here is that painting. Now, Venus is the Roman goddess of love. The Greek equivalent would be Aphrodite, if you're more familiar with Greek mythology. But again, you can see all those themes we talked about. Again, bright colors everywhere in this painting. You've got idealized beauty, especially with Venus here in the center, the goddess of love. You've got, some symmetry and proportionality with, one individual this way, one individual this way. You've got kind of this depth with these trees and kind of going backwards on this pond. And you've got shading to give, all over down here at the bottom and the background, the shell, individuals that kind of adds that 3D look. And again, we've got that theme of ancient Roman mythology here, which kind of fits with Roman artwork or Roman Renaissance artwork. Now, last is Michelangelo, who lived from 1475 to 1564. Now, one of his most famous works was the 18-foot sculpture of David and Goliath fame, but he's also very well known for painting the Sistine Chapel frescoes all on the ceiling and along the walls, which covered 10,000 square feet and took him 4 years to complete. And on the left side here, this is an example of that work. This is known as the Deluge. And this depicts, you can't see the whole panel, but it depicts basically the flood and Noah's Ark. And you can see people kind of cowering here and kind of the water in the background and the ark in the kind of noted here. And so, he completed this over a 4-year time span, which was very long, grueling work. In the midst of all this, he also pioneered a new painting style known as Mannerism, which others would go on to copy. And in this, he kind of takes those characteristics we talked about and he flips them on their head. With Mannerism, you tend to exaggerate proportions, balance, and ideal beauty. So you kind of do the opposite of what we talked about with those characteristics, which often resulted in compositions that were asymmetrical and unnaturally elegant. So, he wasn't necessarily worried about kind of that hyper-realism that many of these other Renaissance artists were trying to accomplish with their art. Now, here is the Sistine Chapel, or part of the Sistine Chapel ceiling, I should say. Now, you can see here's the deluge we were just talking about. So this is what we were just seeing a fraction of on the other slide. And you can see other biblical kind of works here. Here are two of his most famous works. David, 1504. Again, millions of people come and see that every year. And then this is another piece of the fresco in the Sistine Chapel. So this is the creation of Adam, where you see kind of God reaching out to Adam and kind of the spark of life. And if we went back, we could see this in those panels that we looked at. And this is an interesting juxtaposition of both ancient and modern for that time ideas. So this is, we see God here depicted, and look at how God is imagined. A big, strong man with white hair and white beard. Michelangelo really took inspiration, a lot of imagery of God at that time was taking inspiration from Zeus of Greek mythology, or Jupiter from Roman mythology, which is essentially the same person. And this is a bust of Zeus from 200 years before Christ, and you can see very similar features in this bust of Zeus and the depiction of Michelangelo chooses for God. So you can see kind of the influence of these ancient ideas and it reflected in the artwork, even biblical artwork. Now, lastly, we're going to talk about Renaissance architecture, which is a form of art in and of itself, right? So characteristics of Renaissance architecture really kind of mirrored art in a lot of ways. One, it was very symmetrical. This is St. Peter's Basilica, and if you can see, if we split it right here down the center, you could essentially fold this building on itself and it would be perfectly symmetrical. I mean, look, you've got clock on this side, clock on this side, door down here, door down here. So it's very symmetrical in its design. It's proportional. Everything's kind of the right size for what it is. Domes were a big aspect of architecture. If you look back at the images of Florence, or go find images from Florence, or if you traveled to Florence, you will note there were tons of domes across that city, which many of those were built during this Renaissance period. And then columns. Okay, we can see all these columns, Roman and Greek, along the front of St. Peter's Basilica, which we still see in modern architecture today, right? I mean, think of the White House, which has those Roman and Greek columns. So this is still something that's kind of bled into Western civilization, even here in the United States. Here's another example of Renaissance architecture with the Villa Capra La Rotunda. And again, you can see that symmetry and all those things we're talking about. And here's even a better view on the right-hand side. This is kind of a schematic of the building, like an aerial view down. And you can see how symmetrical this is with these 4 entrances, and all these rooms are essentially mirror images of what's across from it, with the circular part where the dome is in the middle. So great example of Renaissance architecture. So that's it for the Renaissance. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me or drop a comment below. And I'll catch you next time.